My name is April, I'm 51, and I've been living in a camper full time. Why? Well, that's kind of a long story, and I didn't really want to make this video because this one's going to be about the death of my dream. So I bought this camper thinking that I would buy a little piece of property, park my camper on it, and live in that camper while I built the infrastructure for a homestead around it. So I grew up Mormon, and that pioneer spirit has always been instilled in me. And I went on to become a teacher of early American history and fell even more in love with the idea of buying some land and building an off-grid homestead. You know, I like the idea of escaping the rat race, getting away from the commercialism, and, you know, kind of like living Amish, but with a little more technology. So it was during the pandemic when I set out to make this dream a reality. And there were a couple things that I had to do first. Number one was save money. And number two was develop some source of income that I could generate from home. So I opened an Etsy shop and I used my talents of sewing to create an income. And it took a while, but eventually I did create a modest income that I could live off of were I to move on to a homestead. While I was building this business, I also decided to take a few seasonal jobs, things that I could do to gain knowledge and expand on my skills that would help me once I became a homesteader. So for example, I worked at a farm and learned how to grow food in Colorado climate. And I also taught homesteading classes where I expanded on my knowledge of canning and sewing. So those were a couple of things that I did in preparation for moving out onto the homestead. And then I researched areas in Colorado that allowed off-grid living, RV living, things about drilling wells. And I also looked at climate and native plants, all the things that I would need to know about in order to buy that land and start an off-grid homestead. And then eventually when things seemed right, I went ahead and bought my camper. I put my notice in on my lease in the city and I headed out on the road. I went, after getting used to being in the camper, then I went out to the areas where I was interested in buying land so that I could experience it firsthand and also have a chance to talk to the locals about my dreams. And that's actually where everything fell apart, was when I actually got into the area and started doing some real in-depth research on site. Now, before I get into all the homesteading things, I just want to mention that a big part of this dream falling apart was the economy. My business tanked by about 60%. It's not because of tariffs, because none of my materials are, you know, subjected to tariffs, and my prices did not change. The reason why my business tanked is because my clients don't have money to spend on things from Etsy. You know, it's luxury spending, and people just don't have that money anymore. So there were a few places in Colorado that I was specifically looking at, places that are deemed to be off-grid friendly. That would be Huerfano County, Seguache, Park, and Costilla. And I looked in each one of these 4 counties and their regulations, ordinances, and opportunities, you know, what kind of land is available. I talked to locals who were living off-grid about how they did it, and most of them did it in the 80s and early 90s. So the laws are completely different now. I did know that in these areas there are Amish communities, so I know that homesteading is possible. And when I say that, what I mean is water is available and plants can be grown for food. So I knew it was possible in theory, but I didn't realize all of the regulations and ordinances that come into play when you want to live on your land full time. And that leads me to the first and biggest issue that I ran into almost immediately, and that is the red tape the bureaucracy of being permitted. And everything that you do on your own property has to be permitted in one way or another. You know, when I was talking to locals, they all told me the same thing, and that is, don't get a permit, don't ask for permission. The minute that you go to get a permit, you're on their radar, and that's the last thing that you want, so just don't do it. And I understand their thinking behind that, but at the same time, if I were to sell my property, want to sell my property, there could be some huge issues with things not being permitted. And also, if someone reports you or if you get found out, the fines are so steep, and some of them even require jail time. And that's just not something that I'm willing to risk, especially in the country where people always talk about freedom. You know, this is where you go for freedom, but they'll be the first ones to report you if they don't like you or think that you aren't following the rules the way they want you to. So to me, it wasn't worth the risk. And in all of these locations, you do have to have a permit to be on your own land for any length of time. And there are certain requirements in order to obtain that permit. And the first thing that you have to do is have road access, which requires a permit. And that's just a permit to access your land. You have to have a whole new permit, a whole different permit to build a driveway. So, okay. And the permit wasn't that expensive in most of these counties, but it is an expense nonetheless. The second thing that you need for a permit is a water source. So you either have to drill a well or have a cistern. If you drill a well, it could be $45 or even hundreds of dollars per foot to drill. And we're talking about land in the high desert. So we're talking tens of thousands of dollars to have access to well water. And a cistern is a less costly option, but they do require your cistern to be a minimum of 500 gallons. And not all of these areas have water delivery services, which means that you have to go somewhere to get water to then transfer into your cistern. And to do that, you need a big truck. And my truck doesn't have a flatbed that I could put like a tote in the back or something. So I would have to buy a whole vehicle in order to do that. And the third thing that you need for a permit to stay on your property is a septic system. There's no parking your RV on your own property filled with potable water, and there's no digging of an outhouse, which I think is really weird because I was staying on BLM land while I was out there, and they have pit toilets. I don't know. Laws are funny, aren't they? Unfortunately, there are a lot of advertisements for land in the area that are incredibly misleading. And today I just want to go over one of them and what I found out about the different things that are included in this ad. So let's take a look.
All right, let's take a look at this advertisement just because it's really detailed. First of all, I want you to notice that it says $160 a month here, but if you scroll down, it says $188 a month, which is, negligible amount of money. Who cares? The one thing that I do want to pay attention to is that it says RVs, camping, and mobile homes are allowed. And that's partially true. But if you look up for this county, it's going to tell you that you can park there for 14 days, 2 weeks, in a 3-month period without a permit. So only 2 weeks in 3 months can you be on your own property without a permit. After those 14 days, you have to have a permit. And that permit is only going to be good for 60 days at a time. And in order to have that permit, you have to have a well or a cistern and a septic system on your property. And they're not just going to give you that permit, they're going to come out to your property and they're going to do a physical inspection to make sure that those things are in place before they give you that permit. And that 60-day permit can only be renewed 3 times for a total of 180 days per year that you can stay in your RV on your own property without having a house built. You know, it's funny. I was talking to somebody about this very issue, and they said to me, well, just build a garage on your property and put your camper in there, and nobody will ever know. And it's hilarious to me that people have suggestions like this. Simple, solutions to complicated problems, because here is the problem with that. You have to have a permit to build a garage, and you can't build a garage unless there is a house on your property first. In fact, you cannot build any accessory buildings on your property unless a house is built. So it's laughable that this advertisement would say you could bring your vision to life without red tape. And are you thinking about building a cabin? Well, your plans better be bigger than 600 square feet and be engineered for high winds and heavy snow loads. And if you're thinking about raising chickens or starting a garden, you need to know that there are special rules about water use on properties less than 35 acres. This property is 5 acres, meaning you can only get a well for domestic use, meaning in the house only. So if you want to water a garden or have chickens outside, you got to pay extra for that. And it's funny how algorithms work, because when I was in the area looking at land, a documentary by PBS popped up in my feed describing the history of land sales in the area and why people were flocking here to homestead and why it didn't work out. And if you're interested, I'll put the links down below.
Period. Newspapers are writing terrible things about the Mexicans, that they'll sell their land for cheap.
The mentality is still to come into Castilla County and purchase cheap land.
They probably Googled something like cheap land, Colorado.
The reason that I bought the land that I did, I'm not going to lie, the land's cheap here.
So in the end, I learned that it's totally possible to create an off-grid homestead in Colorado. If you're independently wealthy, you have to have a lot of money up front. And one of the reasons for me wanting to build a homestead slowly was to prevent having to take out a huge loan. If I wanted to take out a huge loan, I could just buy a homestead that's already up and running. Defeats the whole point. And I'm just one person. I don't have a partner. I only have one income, or well, 1 or 2 incomes at a time. And it's unfortunate that it didn't work out, but it was a really interesting experience to be on the road and living in a camper for as long as I did. My plans have changed, and that's okay. The plan of building a homestead from the dirt up is not as appealing as it once was, and that's also okay. And I still have that pioneer spirit. It's just time to change plans and start working on something else.